What if I told you that behind every president's polished portrait was a child living a life stranger, sadder, or more surprising than anything in the history books? That one president's son secretly worked as a spy? That another's daughter was locked away and hidden from the public for her entire life? That a president's child once got arrested, another eloped in the dead of night, and one was literally born inside the White House itself? You probably think you know the presidents, their speeches, their policies, their portraits hanging in dusty hallways. But behind closed doors, in nurseries and hospital rooms and secret letters, their children were living stories that never made it into your textbooks. Some were tragic, some were scandalous, some were oddly wholesome. All of them were real. Tonight we're going to slow things down. No sirens, no scandals shouted at you. Just quiet, fascinating history. The kind that lulls your mind while it fills your head with facts you never knew you needed. These are the sons and daughters standing just outside the spotlight, shaped by power they never asked for, living lives history mostly forgot to mention. Before we drift into the past together, do me a small favor. Hit that subscribe button and tap the like icon. It costs you nothing, but it helps this channel keep uncovering the quiet corners of history that deserve to be remembered. Now dim the lights, get comfortable, and let your mind wander as we uncover 100 secrets about the children of the presidents that you were almost certainly never taught in school. Let's begin in 1806 with a boy nobody expected to matter at all. Number 1. George Washington Parke Custis. George Washington never had biological children of his own, but he and Martha raised her grandchildren after their father died young. One of these was George Washington Parke Custis, a boy who grew up surrounded by the weight of a name he didn't choose. He inherited land along the Potomac River, directly across from the new capital city. On that land, he built a mansion called Arlington House, designed with towering columns meant to evoke ancient Greece. He filled it with relics from Mount Vernon, determined to preserve his adoptive grandfather's legacy. He probably never imagined that decades later, the surrounding grounds would become Arlington National Cemetery, one of the most solemn places in America. A boy raised in the shadow of the first president ended up creating, quite literally, the resting ground for generations of soldiers who came after him. Number 2. And speaking of the Custis family preserving Washington's legacy, his sister deserves just as much credit. Martha Parke Custis Peter grew up alongside her brother in the same household, absorbing the same stories about their step-grandfather. As an adult, she became one of the family's most devoted keepers of memory. She held onto letters, furniture, and personal items connected to Mount Vernon, treating them less like antiques and more like sacred relics. Much of what historians know today about daily life at Mount Vernon comes from items and stories preserved by her and her siblings. Without her quiet insistence on holding on to the past, pieces of Washington's personal world might have simply faded away, scattered and forgotten like so many other early American households. Number 3. And speaking of family members who suffered quietly behind the scenes, John Adams's daughter Nabby faced one of the most painful ordeals imaginable. Formerly named Abigail Adams Smith, she was known to everyone as Nabby. In 1811, she discovered a lump in her breast. By 1813, with cancer spreading, she underwent a mastectomy performed without anesthesia, using only the crude surgical tools of the era. Her father, former President John Adams, was reportedly present in the house during the procedure, unable to do anything but wait. Nabby survived the surgery itself, but the cancer eventually returned and took her life 2 years later. Her ordeal reflects just how brutal medicine was, even for families connected to the highest levels of American government. Number 4. And speaking of strange things kept inside the White House, John Quincy Adams reportedly kept a pet alligator there during his presidency. The story goes that the Marquis de Lafayette gave Adams the alligator as an unusual gift during his visit to the United States. Rather than turning it away, Adams supposedly housed the reptile in an unfinished bathroom inside the East Room, occasionally showing it off to curious visitors. There's some debate among historians about how much of this story is confirmed fact versus popular legend, but it has persisted for generations. True or embellished, it captures something charming about the eccentric character of early presidential households, long before strict security protocols made such surprises impossible. Number 5. And speaking of Adams' family tragedies, his eldest son, George Washington Adams, met a devastating end. Burdened by financial troubles and personal struggles, George boarded a steamship traveling along the Hudson River in 1829. Passengers later reported that he behaved erratically during the voyage, distressed and disoriented. At some point during the night, he went overboard into the dark water and drowned. His death was ruled either an accident or a possible suicide, though the full truth was never confirmed. It served as a painful reminder that even within one of America's most accomplished political families, personal despair could take hold, hidden behind the appearance of privilege and opportunity. Number 6. And speaking of Adams' children who left a lasting mark on history, his son Charles Francis Adams took a different path entirely. Appointed as the American minister to Britain during the Civil War, Charles worked tirelessly behind the scenes to prevent the British government from formally recognizing the Confederacy. Had that recognition happened, it might have provided the South with crucial diplomatic and material support. Charles used careful negotiation and steady diplomatic pressure to keep Britain neutral throughout the conflict. Historians largely credit his quiet, persistent efforts as a significant factor in isolating the Confederacy internationally. Unlike his father and grandfather, both presidents, Charles never sought the highest office himself, choosing instead a life-shaping outcomes from just outside the spotlight. Number 7. And speaking of presidents who expanded their families in unexpected ways, Andrew Jackson never had biological children of his own, but that didn't stop him from building a household full of them. After his wife's nephew died young, Jackson stepped in and adopted the orphaned boy. And in a move that still confuses historians trying to keep the family tree straight, he gave the child his own name. Andrew Jackson Jr. grew up in the shadow of one of the most fiery personalities in American political history, raised on the Hermitage plantation in Tennessee. He wasn't particularly interested in politics himself, and by most accounts he struggled financially throughout his adult life, often relying on his adoptive father's reputation and occasional financial rescues to stay afloat. Jackson doted on him anyway, treating him with the same fierce loyalty he showed everyone he considered family. It's a quiet reminder that even the most combative figures in history often reserved a softer side for the children they chose to raise, whether or not those children shared their blood. Number 8. And speaking of Andrew Jackson's unconventional approach to fatherhood, his adoption of a Creek orphan named Lincoln reveals an even more complicated story. During the Creek War in 1813, American forces destroyed the Creek town of Taloshatchee, and in the aftermath, soldiers found an orphaned infant among the dead. Jackson, who had commanded the attack, decided to take the child in and raise him at the Hermitage alongside his own family. He gave the boy the name Lincoln and reportedly expressed genuine affection for him, even hoping to send him to West Point someday. The arrangement sits uneasily in historical memory, a man responsible for violence against Native communities, also personally raising a child orphaned by that very violence. Lincoln never lived to see adulthood. He died of tuberculosis in his teenage years, a common and often fatal illness of the era. His short life remains one of the more haunting footnotes tucked inside Jackson's otherwise thunderous historical legacy. Number 9. And speaking of women who quietly ran the White House without ever being elected to anything, Sarah York Jackson stepped into a role few young women could have imagined for themselves. She married Andrew Jackson Jr., making her the president's daughter-in-law, and because Jackson had lost his own wife Rachel before he ever took office, the household needed someone to manage its social duties. Sarah, alongside another relative, took turns serving as White House hostess, organizing dinners, greeting guests, and handling the delicate social choreography expected of the era's political gatherings. She managed all of this while raising young children of her own inside the busy, often chaotic presidential household. Her contributions rarely make it into the headlines of presidential history, overshadowed by the loud personalities surrounding her. But the day-to-day operation of early White House social life often depended entirely on women like her, working quietly behind the scenes to keep everything functioning smoothly. Number 10. And speaking of presidential households that looked a little different from the rest, Martin Van Buren's family had an unusual distinction of its own. All 5 of his children who survived into adulthood were sons, meaning the Van Buren White House never had a presidential daughter running through its halls. Van Buren's wife Hannah died years before he became president, leaving him a widower throughout his time in office. Without a first lady or daughters to fill the traditional social hosting roles, the responsibility eventually fell to other women connected to the family. The absence of daughters made the Van Buren household somewhat unique among early presidencies, many of which featured daughters who became prominent social figures in their own right. Instead, Van Buren's presidency became something of a father and son's operation, with the men of the family filling roles that women typically held in similar households of the time. Number 11. And speaking of sons who took on more than just family duties, Abraham Van Buren became far more than just the president's eldest child. He served as his father's private secretary throughout much of his presidency, managing correspondence, scheduling, and the kind of behind-the-scenes political work that never makes it into textbooks, but keeps an administration functioning. Abraham had attended West Point and served in the military before shifting into this more political role alongside his father. Because there was no first lady during Van Buren's presidency, Abraham's wife, Angelica Singleton Van Buren, stepped in to serve as the White House hostess, adding another unusual layer to an already unconventional presidential household. Abraham's closeness to his father meant he wasn't just family. He was essentially a trusted advisor, working quietly in rooms where major decisions took shape, largely unnoticed by the public focus on the president himself. Number 12. And speaking of presidents whose families kept growing and growing, John Tyler holds a record that remains unmatched among American presidents. Across 2 marriages, Tyler fathered 15 children, more than any other person to hold the office. His first wife, Letitia, gave birth to 8 children before her death, and after Tyler remarried a much younger woman named Julia Gardner, they had 7 more together. The sheer size of Tyler's family meant that keeping track of birthdays, marriages, and eventual grandchildren became something of a logistical challenge even for historians studying him afterward. Some of his children were adults before others were even born, creating an age gap wide enough that certain siblings were closer in age to their nieces and nephews than to each other. Tyler's enormous family became a quiet testament to just how much a presidential household could expand across decades, long before anyone worried about matching everyone's faces to their names at family gatherings. Number 13. And speaking of John Tyler's enormous brood of children, one of them went on to build a legacy entirely separate from politics. Lyon Gardner Tyler, one of the children from Tyler's second marriage to Julia Gardner, grew up to become a historian and academic rather than following his father into elected office. He eventually became president of the College of William and Mary in Virginia, the very institution where his father had once studied. Lyon took his role seriously, working to modernize the college and expand its academic reputation during a period when many small Southern institutions struggled to stay afloat. He also spent considerable energy writing about his father's presidency and defending his family's historical legacy, sometimes controversially, as he tried to shape how history remembered a man whose administration had been relatively obscure compared to the drama of his personal life. Lyon's dedication to preserving his father's reputation, combined with his own genuine academic achievements, made him one of the more intellectually accomplished children to come out of any presidential family. It's a quiet example of how the ripple effects of a presidency can echo generations later, not through politics, but through classrooms, libraries, and the careful, patient work of historical preservation. Number 14. And speaking of just how far John Tyler's family tree stretched, here's a detail that tends to surprise people the first time they hear it. Because Tyler fathered children so late in life, and because some of those children also had children later in life themselves, the generational gaps stacked up in an unusual way. 2 of John Tyler's grandsons, born decades after his own children, lived long enough to survive into the 21st century. That means a man born in 1790, before the country had even settled into its earliest political systems, has direct descendants who are alive at the same time as people using smartphones and streaming services. It sounds almost like a historical glitch, but it's simply the result of consistently late fatherhood across multiple generations of the Tyler family. It's the kind of detail that quietly reshapes how distant history can feel, collapsing what seems like centuries into just a few overlapping lifetimes. A presidency that ended in 1845 somehow reached forward, generation by generation, until it brushed up against modern memory. Number 15. And speaking of presidents whose households look different from what people might expect, James K. Polk and his wife Sarah never had biological children of their own. Polk was famously devoted to his work, and Sarah ran a disciplined, highly organized household that left little room for the kind of domestic distractions other presidential families managed. Still, the Polk home in Tennessee wasn't empty of children. The couple took in and helped raise young relatives, nieces and nephews who needed guidance or support, blending them into the rhythms of their household even without any formal adoption. This kind of informal caretaking was fairly common in the era, when extended families often stepped in for one another without much fanfare or legal paperwork. Sarah, in particular, took an active interest in these young relatives, offering the kind of steady presence that came naturally to a woman known for her sharp intellect and careful management of both political and domestic affairs. It's a reminder that family, especially in the 19th century, wasn't always defined strictly by biology. Sometimes it was simply about who showed up, who needed a home, and who was willing to provide one. Number 16. And speaking of presidential daughters whose lives took dramatic turns, Zachary Taylor's daughter Mary Taylor became connected to one of the most consequential figures in American history. In 1835, Mary married a young Army officer named Jefferson Davis, the same man who would later lead the Confederacy during the Civil War. At the time of their marriage, Davis was simply a promising young lieutenant, and Taylor, his commanding officer, reportedly disapproved of the match, worried about the hardships of military life for his daughter. The wedding is sometimes described as taking place with family involvement despite these tensions, though accounts vary on the finer details. Tragically, the marriage was short-lived. Mary contracted malaria just months after the wedding and died at only 21 years old. Davis was reportedly devastated by her death, and some historians believe it deeply shaped the more guarded, serious demeanor he carried for years afterward. It's a quiet, somber footnote tucked inside two very different chapters of American history, connecting a future president's household to a name that would later become synonymous with the nation's most painful conflict. Number 17. And speaking of daughters who quietly held families together during difficult circumstances, Zachary Taylor's daughter Anne Mackall Taylor Wood took on more responsibility than most young women of her era ever expected to carry. As a military family, the Taylors moved frequently, often to remote outposts far from the comforts of established towns. Anne spent years helping manage the household during these postings, supporting her mother, who struggled with poor health for much of her life, and helping care for younger siblings during long stretches when her father was away commanding troops. This kind of steady behind-the-scenes labor rarely gets mentioned in history books focused on battles and political appointments, but it was essential to keeping military families functioning during an era with few conveniences and even fewer support systems. Anne's contributions continued even after her father became president, as she occasionally stepped into hostess duties during his short time in the White House, filling gaps left by her mother's declining health. Her life reflects a broader pattern seen throughout presidential families, where daughters often carried quiet, essential burdens that made everything else possible, even though history remembers the men standing at the front of the room. Number 18. And speaking of presidential children whose lives ended far too soon, Millard Fillmore's son carried a name that made his identity almost impossible to separate from his father's legacy. Millard Powers Fillmore grew up largely out of the public eye, overshadowed by his father's political rise and by his sister, who took a more visible role during their father's presidency after their mother's declining health limited her public duties. Millard Powers pursued a quieter path, though detailed records of his adult life remain limited compared to more prominent presidential children. Tragically, his life was cut short. He died at only 22 years old, a loss that came as a heavy blow to a family already familiar with grief, having lost Fillmore's wife not long after his presidency ended. Losing a child so young was devastatingly common in the 19th century, even within families with access to the best available medical care of the time. Millard Powers Fillmore's brief life stands as a quiet reminder that presidential households, despite their proximity to power and privilege, were never shielded from the same fragile realities of health and mortality that shaped nearly every American family during this era. Number 19. And speaking of presidential children whose contributions were quieter but still meaningful, Millard Fillmore's daughter Abigail left her own mark on the White House in a way that still benefits visitors today. Abigail, often called Abby by her family, stepped into hostess duties alongside her father after her mother's health declined, but her more lasting contribution came from something less ceremonial. She and her mother, Abigail Fillmore, shared a deep love of books and were reportedly troubled to discover that the White House had no dedicated library at all. Working together, mother and daughter pushed for the creation of a proper library space, gathering books and encouraging Congress to allocate funds for the collection. The result was the first official White House library, a modest but meaningful addition that gave future presidents and their families a permanent space for reading and reflection. Abby's role in this effort often gets overshadowed by her more visible duties as a young hostess, but the library itself outlived her father's single term by generations. It's easy to imagine history remembered only through speeches and policies, but sometimes the quieter additions, a shelf of books, a reading room, a space for quiet thought, end up shaping the White House in ways that stretch far beyond any one administration. Abby Fillmore's legacy isn't loud, but it's the kind of legacy that lingers, tucked into the walls of a house that has seen nearly 2 centuries of history unfold around it. Number 20. And speaking of grief that arrived just as a presidency was beginning, Franklin Pierce's family experienced a tragedy so severe that it shadowed his entire time in office. Pierce and his wife Jane had already lost 2 young children before he was elected, but their third and only surviving son, Benny, was still alive as the family prepared to move into the White House. Just weeks before Pierce's inauguration, the family boarded a train traveling through Massachusetts when it derailed. Benny, only 11 years old, was killed instantly. Franklin and Jane witnessed the accident firsthand, a horror that neither of them ever fully recovered from. Pierce entered his presidency, grieving so deeply that some historians believe it affected his ability to lead effectively from the very beginning. Jane, already prone to poor health and melancholy, withdrew from public life almost entirely, rarely appearing at White House functions during her husband's term. The tragedy cast a long shadow over an administration already struggling with the mounting tensions that would eventually lead to the Civil War. It's a somber reminder that presidents don't leave their personal lives at the door when they take office. Sometimes the heaviest burdens they carry have nothing to do with policy or politics at all, but with private losses so devastating that an entire presidency unfolds beneath their weight. Number 21. And speaking of children whose lives intersected with tragedy in ways that feel almost impossible to believe, Abraham Lincoln's eldest son, Robert Todd Lincoln, held an unfortunate connection to not just one presidential assassination, but 3. Robert was present at Ford's Theater the night his father was shot, rushing to his side as the tragedy unfolded. Years later, he was invited to attend an event with President James Garfield and was nearby when Garfield was shot by an assassin in 1881. Decades after that, Robert was present once again, this time as an invited guest, when President William McKinley was shot in 1901. Understandably, Robert became famously reluctant to attend presidential events afterward, reportedly joking with dark humor about being invited anywhere near a sitting president. He went on to have an accomplished life of his own, serving as Secretary of War and later as a diplomat, but this strange pattern of proximity to tragedy followed him for the rest of his life. Historians still find the coincidence remarkable, a single man connected by circumstance to 3 of the 4 presidential assassinations in American history. It's the kind of detail that feels almost too strange to be true. Yet it's thoroughly documented, a quiet, haunting thread running through one family's experience of loss during one of the most turbulent periods in the nation's history. Number 22. And speaking of lighter moments inside a household otherwise touched by so much sorrow, Abraham Lincoln's youngest son, Tad, brought a surprising amount of chaos and joy into the White House during the Civil War years. Tad was known for his mischievous energy, and Lincoln, despite the enormous weight of the war, often indulged his son's antics rather than restrain them. Tad kept an impressive collection of pets, including 2 goats named Nanny and Nanko, who reportedly wandered the White House grounds and occasionally made their way inside. Staff members recalled Tad hitching the goats to chairs and racing through the halls, much to the amusement or occasional exasperation of White House visitors. Lincoln himself seemed to enjoy these distractions, sometimes pausing serious meetings to indulge his son's requests or laugh at his latest adventure. Given the immense stress of leading the country through war, historians often note that Tad's playful presence may have offered Lincoln rare moments of relief during an otherwise crushing presidency. It's a small, warm detail tucked inside a much darker chapter of American history, a reminder that even during the nation's most difficult years, ordinary family life, complete with pets, mischief, and childhood energy, continued quietly behind the weight of world-changing decisions. Number 23. And speaking of loss that struck even deeper within the Lincoln household, Abraham Lincoln's 11-year-old son Willie died in the White House in 1862, in the middle of the Civil War. Willie had fallen ill with what was likely typhoid fever, a common and often fatal illness at the time, especially given the poor water quality plaguing Washington during the war. His death devastated both parents, but Mary Lincoln in particular struggled profoundly, reportedly unable to attend the funeral, and spending months in deep mourning that some historians believe contributed to her later struggles with grief and mental health. Abraham Lincoln, already carrying the immense burden of leading a divided nation through its bloodiest conflict, was seen weeping openly, a rare public display for a man usually associated with quiet composure. Some accounts suggest Lincoln found brief comfort in spiritual mediums that Mary consulted afterward, desperate for any sense of connection to their lost son. Willie's death remains one of the most heartbreaking personal tragedies to occur inside the White House, a private sorrow playing out publicly during a national crisis. It's a stark reminder that even a president guiding the country through its darkest chapter still had to carry the ordinary, devastating weight of losing a child, grief that no position of power could soften or delay. Number 24. And speaking of losses that came even earlier in the Lincoln family story, Abraham and Mary's second son, Edward Baker Lincoln, died before reaching his 4th birthday, years before his father ever became president. Eddie, as he was affectionately known, fell ill in early 1850, likely from what historians believe was tuberculosis, and passed away after a prolonged illness that left the family devastated. This loss occurred long before the pressures of the presidency or the chaos of the Civil War, during a quieter period when Lincoln was still building his career as a lawyer in Illinois. Mary Lincoln, already prone to emotional strain, was profoundly affected by Eddie's death, and some historians believe this early loss laid the groundwork for the grief that would resurface so powerfully after Willie's death more than a decade later. Child mortality remained tragically common throughout the 19th century, even among families who would eventually rise to the highest levels of American political life. Eddie's brief life is often overshadowed by the more publicly documented death of his brother Willie, but his loss shaped the Lincoln family long before the nation ever came to know them. It's a quiet, early sorrow tucked into the background of a family whose story would later become inseparable from some of the most defining tragedies in American history. Number 25. And speaking of daughters who stepped into unexpected roles when their mothers could no longer manage the demands of the White House, Andrew Johnson's daughter Martha Johnson Patterson took on hostess duties during one of the most turbulent presidencies in American history. Johnson became president under extraordinary circumstances, taking office after Lincoln's assassination and immediately facing the enormous challenges of Reconstruction. His wife Eliza suffered from tuberculosis and was often too unwell to handle the social obligations expected of a first lady, so Martha quietly assumed those responsibilities instead. She managed the household with practicality rather than extravagance, even famously keeping a cow on the White House lawn to ensure fresh milk for the family, a detail that feels almost quaint against the political chaos surrounding her father's impeachment trial. Martha balanced grace and frugality at a time when the nation itself felt anything but stable, hosting guests and maintaining a sense of normalcy even as Congress debated removing her father from office. Historians often note that her steady presence provided a calming influence during a presidency defined by conflict and controversy. It's easy to overlook these quieter contributions when history books focus on impeachment articles and political maneuvering, but Martha's willingness to step forward when her mother couldn't offers a gentler thread running through an otherwise turbulent chapter of the Johnson family's time in Washington. Number 26. And speaking of presidential children who carved out careers connected to government work without ever seeking the spotlight themselves, Andrew Johnson's son Robert pursued a path in publishing that eventually tied him to government printing operations. Robert had a complicated life marked by personal struggles, but he also served his father in an official capacity, working as a secretary during the presidency and helping manage correspondence during an incredibly difficult period. His later career moved toward publishing work, an industry closely intertwined with the government printing operations centered in Washington at the time. This kind of quiet administrative work rarely makes it into the dramatic retellings of presidential history, yet it represents an important thread connecting family members to the daily machinery of government function. Robert's path wasn't one of grand political ambition or public acclaim, but rather steady behind-the-scenes involvement in the practical operations that kept information flowing during a chaotic era. It's worth remembering that not every presidential child sought fame or political office. Some simply found their place in the quieter corners of public service, doing necessary work far from the public eye. Robert Johnson's story is a reminder that history isn't only made in speeches and headlines. Sometimes it's made in printing offices and administrative rooms, in the steady, unglamorous work that keeps a government running behind the scenes. Number 27. And speaking of presidential sons who built successful lives far removed from politics, Ulysses S. Grant's eldest son, Frederick, often known by his full name Frederick Dent Grant, eventually gave way in family stories to his younger brother Ulysses Jr., who carved out a notable career as a lawyer and businessman in California. After growing up amid the fame surrounding his father's military and political achievements, Ulysses Jr. pursued a legal education and eventually settled on the West Coast, building a respected practice and expanding into various business ventures. He became known in California's social and professional circles, his family name opening doors but his own work ethic and legal acumen keeping them open. Unlike some presidential children who struggled under the weight of their father's legacy, Ulysses Jr. seemed to navigate it comfortably, using the Grant name as a foundation rather than a burden. His business interest grew over time, reflecting the expanding opportunities of California during a period of significant economic growth in the region. It's a fairly quiet success story compared to the dramatic ups and downs of his father's own life, which included both the heights of military triumph and the depths of financial scandal later in life. Sometimes the children of presidents simply live steady, productive lives away from the glare of Washington, and Ulysses Grant Jr.'s career stands as a gentle example of exactly that kind of quiet accomplishment. Number 28. And speaking of White House celebrations that captured the public imagination during the 19th century, Ulysses S. Grant's daughter Nellie held what became one of the most talked about weddings in the history of the executive mansion. In 1874, Nellie married Algernon Sartoris, an Englishman she had met while traveling abroad, and the ceremony was held right in the White House itself. The event was lavish by the standards of the time, filled with flowers, fine clothing, and an atmosphere of celebration that captured widespread public attention. Newspapers covered the wedding extensively, and the public seemed delighted by the glimpse into the personal life of the Grant family during an otherwise politically turbulent period marked by corruption scandals within the administration. Nellie's wedding offered a rare moment of unguarded joy, a spectacle that briefly overshadowed the political troubles swirling around her father's presidency. Unfortunately, her marriage itself did not turn out as happily as the celebration suggested. Sartoris proved to be an unfaithful and difficult husband, and Nellie eventually returned to the United States after years of hardship abroad. Still, the wedding itself remains a memorable moment in White House history, a brief, glittering celebration that gave the public something joyful to focus on. It's a reminder that even amid political scandal, moments of genuine family celebration still found their way into the halls of the White House. Number 29. And speaking of presidential children whose later ventures left a lasting physical mark on American cities, Ulysses S. Grant's youngest son Jesse eventually became associated with a hotel bearing his father's name in San Diego. Jesse Grant pursued various business interests throughout his life, and his involvement with the Ulysses S. Grant Hotel connected the family legacy directly to the growing development of Southern California during the early 20th century. The hotel itself became a prominent fixture in San Diego, a grand building that still stands today as a piece of architectural history in the city's downtown area. Jesse's business ventures extended beyond the hotel as well, reflecting the entrepreneurial spirit that seemed to run through several of Grant's children as they built lives independent of their father's military and political fame. It's a curious kind of legacy, watching a president's name transform from battlefield victories and White House policy into a hospitality landmark in a city his son helped shape decades later. The hotel outlived Jesse himself, continuing to operate under various names and ownership through the 20th century and beyond. Sometimes the descendants of presidents leave their mark not through politics or military achievement, but through buildings, businesses, and quiet contributions to the cities where they eventually settled, carrying the family name forward in ways their fathers likely never anticipated. Number 30. And speaking of presidential fathers, who found lighthearted ways to express affection for their children, Rutherford B. Hayes affectionately nicknamed his lively youngest son Scott Fanning Hayes, a name that reflected the boy's energetic and spirited personality within the family. Scott was known for his playful nature, often bringing a sense of lightness into the Hayes household during his father's presidency. Rutherford Hayes, generally remembered as a fairly reserved and formal figure in public life, apparently enjoyed a warmer, more relaxed relationship with his children behind closed doors, and the affectionate nickname speaks to that softer side rarely seen by the public. Scott's antics and energy reportedly provided moments of levity during a presidency that, while not marked by major scandal, still carried the usual pressures and demands of governing a nation still recovering from the aftermath of Reconstruction. Family nicknames like this one offer a small but meaningful glimpse into the private dynamics of a presidential household, reminding us that even amid formal portraits and public duties, ordinary family warmth persisted behind the scenes. Scott grew up largely out of the public eye compared to some of his siblings, but the nickname his father gave him has survived in family records and letters, a quiet, affectionate detail preserved across generations. It's these small, tender moments, tucked away in personal correspondence, that often reveal the most human side of the men who occupied the highest office in the nation. Number 31. And speaking of presidential sons who found meaningful ways to preserve their father's legacy long after leaving the White House behind, Rutherford B. Hayes' son Webb Hayes dedicated much of his later life to founding the Rutherford B. Hayes Presidential Library and Museums in Fremont, Ohio. Webb had actually served as his father's private secretary during the presidency, giving him an intimate, first-hand understanding of the administration's daily workings that few outside the family ever experienced. That closeness seems to have shaped his lifelong commitment to preserving his father's papers, artifacts, and historical record for future generations. The library he helped establish became the first presidential library in the United States, predating the more famous system of federally funded libraries that came later under Franklin Roosevelt. Webb's efforts ensured that his father's correspondence, speeches, and personal items were carefully collected and protected rather than scattered or lost to time, as happened with so many other presidential records from the era. It's a quiet but significant contribution to American historical preservation, the kind of work that rarely draws headlines but shapes how future historians and curious visitors alike come to understand a presidency. Webb's dedication reflects his son's genuine respect for his father's public service, transformed into a lasting institution rather than simply private memories. Today, researchers and tourists can still walk through the grounds in Fremont, examining the same documents and objects Webb worked so diligently to gather and preserve, a tangible legacy built not on power or fame, but on careful, patient stewardship of history itself. Number 32. And speaking of presidential daughters who stepped forward to support their mothers during moments of profound personal tragedy, James Garfield's daughter Mary, affectionately known within the family as Molly, helped her mother Lucretia manage the overwhelming social and emotional demands that followed her father's assassination in 1881. Garfield had only been in office a matter of months when he was shot, lingering in pain for weeks before finally succumbing to his injuries, an ordeal that left the entire family shattered. Molly, still quite young at the time, found herself thrust into a supporting role many children twice her age would have struggled to handle. She assisted her mother in receiving condolences, managing correspondence, and navigating the strange mixture of public mourning and private grief that followed such a sudden, violent loss. The nation watched closely as the Garfield family processed their sorrow in the public eye, and Molly's quiet composure during this period earned her a measure of sympathy and admiration from observers who recognized the unusual burden placed on her young shoulders. It's worth pausing on just how strange that experience must have been, becoming a symbol of national grief while still simply trying to comfort your own mother. Molly later married and lived a relatively private life away from the political world that had defined her childhood so dramatically. Her steady presence during those difficult months remains one of the more touching, understated details tucked within the tragic story of her father's brief and violently interrupted presidency. Number 33. And speaking of presidential sons who built long distinguished careers in education rather than politics, James Garfield's son Harry became president of Williams College, his father's alma mater, serving in that role for more than 2 decades. Harry pursued a path rooted deeply in academia, eventually rising to lead the very institution where his father had once studied years before entering public life. His tenure at Williams was marked by steady leadership during a period of significant change in American higher education, as colleges adapted to new academic standards and expanding student populations in the early 20th century. Harry also became involved in public service during World War I, serving on National Fuel Administration efforts, blending his academic background with practical wartime responsibilities. It's a fitting kind of legacy, considering how much his father valued education throughout his own life, having risen from humble beginnings through determined scholarship before eventually reaching the presidency. Harry's decades of steady, thoughtful leadership at Williams College stand in quiet contrast to the abrupt, tragic end of his father's own time in public office. Where James Garfield's presidency was cut short after mere months, Harry's academic career stretched on for years, allowing him to build something lasting and stable in an institution far removed from the volatility of national politics. His story offers a gentler continuation of the Garfield family's commitment to learning, carried forward not through legislation or executive power, but through decades of patient, dedicated work, shaping young minds within the halls of higher education. Number 34. And speaking of quiet, private sorrows that presidential families carried long before ever reaching the national stage, James Garfield and his wife Lucretia lost their infant daughter Eliza years before Garfield ever became president. Eliza died as a young child, a loss that occurred during the family's earlier years together, long before politics and public office had entered their lives in any significant way. This kind of grief was tragically common during the era, when childhood illnesses claimed so many young lives regardless of a family's social standing or future prospects. It's easy to overlook these earlier, more private tragedies when history books focus almost entirely on the dramatic assassination that eventually defined Garfield's presidency. But this earlier loss shaped the family long before that fateful day in 1881. Losing a child would have left a lasting mark on both James and Lucretia, quietly influencing their approach to parenting and family life in the years that followed. By the time Garfield entered national politics, the family had already endured heartbreak that had nothing to do with Washington or ambition. It's a somber reminder that presidential families, like countless ordinary families of the period, faced the harsh realities of childhood mortality well before fame or public office ever touched their lives. Eliza's brief life remains a quiet footnote in the broader Garfield family story, overshadowed by later tragedy, yet still a meaningful piece of understanding who James and Lucretia truly were as parents. Number 35. And speaking of presidential daughters who grew into accomplished figures within Washington's social circles, Chester Arthur's daughter Ellen, known affectionately within the family as Nell, became recognized as a skilled and gracious hostess during her father's presidency. Arthur had become president under difficult circumstances, taking office after the assassination of James Garfield, and he did so while still grieving the recent loss of his own wife, Nell Arthur, after whom his daughter had been named. With no First Lady present to fulfill the traditional social duties expected of the White House, young Ellen occasionally stepped into supporting roles, helping bring warmth and grace to an administration shadowed by personal loss. She grew into a poised and capable young woman, comfortable navigating the formal expectations of Washington society even at a relatively young age. Arthur, though sometimes seen publicly as reserved, reportedly doted on his children privately, and Ellen's confident presence within social settings reflected the careful upbringing she received despite the family's tragic circumstances. Her ability to charm and engage guests helped soften some of the somber undertones that lingered over her father's presidency. It's another example of how presidential children often found themselves filling emotional and social gaps left by circumstances entirely beyond their control, growing up quickly under the weight of unexpected responsibility, all while the nation watched a grieving widower attempt to lead the country forward after yet another shocking assassination. Number 36. And speaking of formal introductions into Washington society that carried extra weight simply because of family name, Chester Arthur's daughter Ellen made her official society debut, while her father occupied the White House, drawing considerable public attention and press coverage. Debutante events were significant social occasions during the era, marking a young woman's formal entrance into elite social circles, and having a presidential father only heightened the curiosity and fascination surrounding Ellen's particular debut. Newspapers took interest in the details, from her attire to the guests in attendance, treating the event as a notable moment within the broader social calendar of the capital. For Ellen, the debut represented both a personal milestone and an inevitable public spectacle, given her father's position. Arthur, still navigating his presidency without a first lady by his side, likely took quiet pride in watching his daughter step confidently into this new chapter of her young adult life. It's a small but telling detail about how even personal family milestones became intertwined with public life once a family occupied the White House. Ellen's debut offered a brief moment of lighthearted celebration during an administration otherwise defined by political transition and the lingering shadow of Garfield's assassination. Long after her father's presidency ended, Ellen continued to be remembered as a graceful, socially adept figure, her early introduction into Washington society having set the tone for the composed, capable woman she would become throughout her later life. Number 37. And speaking of presidential family milestones that unfolded with unusual privacy given how much attention the public typically demanded, Grover Cleveland's daughter Ruth was born after her parents held their wedding quietly out of the public eye. Cleveland remains the only president to marry in the White House itself, wedding Frances Folsom in 1886 during his first term, an event that captivated the nation despite the couple's efforts to keep certain details away from prying reporters. Ruth arrived a few years later, becoming one of several children born into a family already accustomed to intense scrutiny. The Clevelands, perhaps more than most presidential families of the era, valued a degree of privacy that stood in contrast to the public's insatiable curiosity about their personal lives. Newspapers of the time treated the couple's relationship, age difference, and eventual children as ongoing sources of fascination, publishing updates on nearly every family development they could uncover. Despite this constant attention, the Clevelands managed to preserve a surprising amount of quiet family life behind closed doors. Ruth's arrival added another layer of warmth to a household already navigating the unusual pressures of combining a young marriage with the demands of the presidency. It's a gentle reminder that even in an era without modern media, presidential families still contended with relentless public interest, carefully balancing personal moments against a nation eager to know every detail of their lives. Number 38. And speaking of unexpected cultural connections that outlived the facts behind them, a popular legend eventually linked Baby Ruth candy bars to Grover Cleveland's daughter Ruth, even though the manufacturer always denied any direct connection. The candy debuted years after Ruth's death, and the company publicly claimed it was named in her honor as a way of invoking nostalgic goodwill rather than paying tribute to any living celebrity, which conveniently sidestepped the need to pay royalties to actual public figures of the time. Many historians view this explanation with skepticism, suspecting it was a clever marketing strategy designed to associate the treat with a beloved sympathetic historical figure rather than risk entanglements with contracts or endorsements. Whatever the true motivation, the story persisted for generations, blending confectionery history with presidential trivia in a way that continues to surface in casual conversations and quiz nights. It's a curious example of how legend and commerce can intertwine, creating a lasting piece of folklore that most people accept without ever questioning its origins. Ruth herself passed away as a child, long before the candy bar carrying her possible namesake became a staple of American snack aisles. The connection, real or invented, has outlived nearly every other detail people remember about her short life, turning a private family tragedy into an oddly enduring piece of pop culture history that still sparks curiosity more than a century later. Number 39. And speaking of firsts that quietly made history within the walls of the White House itself, Grover Cleveland's daughter Esther became the first child born to a sitting president inside the executive mansion. Her birth in 1893, during Cleveland's second, non-consecutive term, drew considerable public interest, marking a genuinely unprecedented moment in the building's long history. Newspapers eagerly reported on the event, treating it as a charming novelty that humanized the presidency in a way few other occurrences could. Esther's arrival offered a brief, warm distraction from the political and economic turmoil brewing at the time, including the financial panic that would soon dominate headlines and challenge Cleveland's administration. It's a small but memorable footnote, the kind of detail that reminds us the White House has always been both a center of political power and, quite literally, a family home. Esther grew up largely outside the public eye compared to her early fame, her later life carrying far less documentation than the excitement surrounding her unusual birth. Still, her distinction as the first presidential child born within those historic walls remains a unique piece of trivia, one that continues to surface whenever discussions turn to the more personal human side of presidential history. It's a gentle example of how even amid political pressures, moments of simple family joy still found their place within the nation's most famous residents. Number 40. And speaking of milestones that once again unfolded within those same historic walls, Grover Cleveland's daughter Frances married Thomas Preston in a White House ceremony held in 1913, long after her father's presidency had ended. This event carried its own quiet significance, connecting a new generation's personal happiness back to a house that had already witnessed so many pivotal family moments for the Clevelands specifically. Frances had grown up largely removed from the intense scrutiny surrounding her parents' earlier years in the spotlight, yet her wedding still attracted public attention simply because of the family name attached to it. Choosing the White House as a wedding venue wasn't unheard of, but it remained a relatively rare and notable choice, tying her personal milestone symbolically back to her father's public legacy, even though he had already passed away years earlier. It's a touching detail, suggesting the family maintained a lasting emotional connection to the building despite the passage of time and changing political administrations. Frances's marriage represented a quiet continuation of the Cleveland family story, blending private happiness with the enduring historical weight of a house so deeply tied to American political life. Long after headlines about her father's presidency had faded, this small family celebration offered one more gentle reminder of how personal and public history so often intertwine within those historic walls. Number 41. And speaking of presidential daughters who stepped comfortably into supporting social roles during their father's time in office, Benjamin Harrison's daughter Mary, affectionately known as Mamie, helped host various events throughout her father's presidency. With her mother Caroline actively serving as First Lady, Mamie often assisted with the many social obligations that came with life in the White House, gaining first-hand experience navigating formal gatherings, receptions, and the countless visitors expected to be welcomed with warmth and grace. This kind of hands-on involvement gave Mamie valuable insight into the delicate balance between personal family life and public representation that so many presidential children quietly learned to manage. Her presence added a sense of familial warmth to official functions, helping soften the formality that often surrounded presidential entertaining during the era. It's a reminder that presidential households frequently functioned as small teams, with children stepping into supportive roles whenever needed, even without formal titles or expectations placed upon them. Mamie's steady, capable presence throughout these events reflected the values instilled by her parents, blending duty with genuine hospitality. Long after her father's single term concluded, Mamie's quiet contributions to those White House years remained a modest but meaningful part of the broader Harrison family story, illustrating how presidential children often played understated yet essential roles in shaping the social atmosphere of an administration. Number 42. And speaking of presidential sons who pursued careers blending public communication with civic responsibility, Benjamin Harrison's son Russell worked as a newspaper publisher, while also serving in the Indiana National Guard. Russell's path reflected a common combination for men of his era, balancing private enterprise with a sense of duty towards state and community service. His work in publishing gave him a platform to engage with public discourse, while his military service connected him to a long tradition of civic obligation that many prominent families of the time considered an important responsibility. Russell's efforts existed largely outside the direct spotlight of his father's presidency, allowing him to build a professional identity rooted in his own accomplishments rather than simply his family name. It's worth noting how many presidential children of this period pursued steady, respectable careers rather than seeking continued political prominence themselves, often preferring quieter paths that still contributed meaningfully to their communities. Russell's combination of journalism and military service painted a picture of a well-rounded, civic-minded individual, someone who valued both public communication and structured service to his state. Long after his father's single term as president concluded, Russell continued building his own modest legacy, one defined not by headlines about the White House, but by steady, practical contributions to Indiana's civic and professional landscape. Number 43. And speaking of presidential families who endured profound personal loss long before reaching the White House, William McKinley's daughters both died in childhood, years before their father ever took the oath of office. Catherine, known as Katie, passed away at age 3 from typhoid fever, while her younger sister Ida died in infancy, living only a few months. These losses occurred during McKinley's early political career, long before anyone could have imagined he would eventually become President of the United States. The grief from losing both children profoundly shaped the McKinley household, and by the time William McKinley reached the presidency, he and his wife Ida were navigating public life without any of their own children by their side. Ida McKinley's health struggles throughout her adult life have often been linked by historians to the emotional toll of these early losses, and William McKinley was known for his unusually attentive care toward his wife throughout his political career. It's a somber reminder that the personal tragedies presidential families experienced didn't always happen within the White House itself, and sometimes the absence of children tells its own quiet story. The McKinleys carried this private sorrow with them throughout their public lives, a gentle but persistent shadow behind the formalities of political success and national prominence. Number 44. And speaking of presidents whose families brought considerably more noise and activity into the White House, Theodore Roosevelt's 6 children filled the halls with an almost endless parade of pets, including a pony, a badger, and even a small bear at various points during his presidency. Roosevelt's youngest children in particular treated the White House less like a formal government building and more like an enormous playground, complete with a menagerie that occasionally startled staff, visitors, and foreign dignitaries alike. The pony reportedly roamed certain areas of the grounds, while the badger named Josiah became something of a household character known for nipping at ankles when provoked. Reports from the era suggest the sheer variety of animals occasionally rivaled a small zoo, reflecting both the children's enthusiasm for nature and Roosevelt's own well-documented love of the outdoors. Staff members adapted as best they could, and many visitors found themselves both amused and slightly alarmed by the unpredictable presence of exotic creatures wandering through otherwise formal spaces. It's a charming, if chaotic, example of how one family's personality could completely transform the atmosphere of the nation's most famous residence. The Roosevelt children's love of animals left a lasting impression, turning the White House briefly into one of the more unusual, lively households in presidential history. Number 45. And speaking of sharp wit inherited directly from a famously outspoken father, Theodore Roosevelt's daughter Alice reportedly kept a pillow embroidered with the phrase, "If you can't say something good, sit next to me," a line that perfectly captured her reputation for sarcasm and social observation. Alice quickly became one of the most talked about young women in America, known for her outspoken opinions, fashionable style, and refusal to conform to the quieter expectations often placed on presidential daughters of her era. Her father reportedly once remarked that he could either run the country or control Alice, but not both, a comment that has been repeated so often it's practically part of American political folklore. Alice's sharp tongue and independent spirit made her a fixture of Washington's social life long after her father's presidency ended, and she remained politically engaged and famously blunt well into old age. The pillow itself, whether displayed prominently or simply mentioned in passing conversation, became emblematic of her personality, a small humorous artifact reflecting a much larger reputation for candor. It's a fitting detail for someone who spent decades offering unsolicited opinions about nearly every major political figure she encountered, cementing her place as one of the most memorable presidential children in American history. Number 46. And speaking of unconventional uses for White House transportation, Theodore Roosevelt's youngest son Quentin once rode his pony named Algonquin directly into a White House elevator, reportedly to cheer up his brother Archie, who was sick in bed at the time. The pony's brief indoor excursion became one of the most retold anecdotes from the Roosevelt years, a small but vivid example of just how much freedom and mischief the younger children enjoyed within the walls of the executive mansion. Staff members apparently tolerated these antics with a mixture of amusement and resignation, having grown accustomed to the unpredictable nature of the household's youngest residents. Quentin, often described as the most adventurous and mischievous of Roosevelt's children, seemed to treat the White House less like a formal government building and more like the ultimate playground for elaborate pranks and animal-related schemes. The story of Algonquin's elevator ride has been repeated so frequently over the years that it's become something of a symbol for the Roosevelt family's generally relaxed, high-energy approach to presidential life. It's a lighthearted reminder that even amid the serious business of governing a nation, moments of genuine childhood joy and spontaneity still found their way into the historic building, offering a softer, more human glimpse into one of America's most memorable presidential families. Number 47. And speaking of unusual pets that push the boundaries of typical household companions, Theodore Roosevelt's son Archie owned a pet snake affectionately named Emily Spinach, a name that remains one of the more curious entries in presidential pet history. The snake reportedly traveled with Archie on occasion, adding yet another creature to the already impressive collection of animals roaming the Roosevelt household during Theodore Roosevelt's presidency. Emily Spinach joined a menagerie that included everything from dogs and cats to more exotic animals like the family's badger and pony, reinforcing just how thoroughly the Roosevelt children embraced their father's enthusiasm for the natural world. Archie's attachment to his unusual pet reflected a broader family culture that treated animals as genuine companions rather than mere curiosities, encouraging hands-on interaction rather than distant admiration. Visitors to the White House during this period likely encountered surprises at nearly every turn, never quite certain which creature might appear next. It's a small but memorable detail that captures the playful, adventurous spirit running throughout the entire Roosevelt family, further illustrating how thoroughly the children's personalities shaped daily life inside the White House. Emily Spinach remains a quirky footnote in presidential history, a gentle reminder that even snakes found a welcoming home among the Roosevelts. Number 48. And speaking of Roosevelt children who ventured far beyond the comforts of the White House grounds, Theodore Roosevelt's son Kermit accompanied his father on the demanding and often dangerous Roosevelt-Rondon scientific expedition through the Amazon rainforest years after his father's presidency had ended. The expedition aimed to chart an unexplored river, later renamed in Roosevelt's honor, and the journey proved far more perilous than Anticone had anticipated, testing the physical endurance and resilience of everyone involved. Kermit played a crucial role throughout the difficult trek, helping manage logistics and providing support, as his father battled illness and injury along the unforgiving route. The dense jungle terrain, unpredictable rivers, and constant threat of disease made the expedition one of the most physically demanding undertakings of Roosevelt's later life, and Kermit's presence proved essential to its eventual success. Their shared experience deepened the bond between father and son, reflecting the adventurous spirit that had defined much of Theodore Roosevelt's own life and worldview. It's a striking example of how the Roosevelt family's love of exploration extended well beyond childhood pets and White House antics into genuinely serious, historically significant expeditions. Kermit's willingness to accompany his aging father into such dangerous territory speaks to a deep sense of loyalty, adventure, and shared purpose that continued long after the family's years inside the White House had ended. Number 49. And speaking of presidential children who found themselves swept up in the pageantry of their father's inauguration, William Howard Taft's daughter Helen made history as the first presidential daughter to ride alongside her father in an inaugural parade. This small but meaningful detail set Helen apart from generations of presidential children who had watched such ceremonies from the sidelines, rather than participating directly in them. Taft's inauguration in 1909 already carried a certain uniqueness, since a late-season snowstorm forced the ceremony indoors, adding an extra layer of memorability to the entire event. Helen's presence in the parade reflected a shift in how presidential families were beginning to engage more visibly and personally with the public celebrations surrounding a new administration. She was a bright, intellectually curious young woman even then, and her participation offered an early glimpse of the accomplished path she would eventually follow. It's a quiet but notable moment in presidential history, a small crack in tradition that allowed the public to see a presidential daughter not simply as an observer, but as an active participant in one of the nation's most symbolic democratic ceremonies. Helen's ride that day foreshadowed a life defined by breaking expectations rather than simply fulfilling them. Number 50. And speaking of presidential children who carried their family's political legacy directly into the halls of Congress, William Howard Taft's son Robert became one of the most influential United States senators of his era, representing Ohio for many years. Robert Taft built a reputation as a serious, principled legislator, earning the nickname Mr. Republican for his significant influence over the party's direction throughout the mid-20th century. Unlike many presidential children who drifted away from politics after their father's time in office, Robert leaned fully into public service, eventually becoming one of the most respected voices in the Senate. He was known for his careful, deliberate approach to policy, often prioritizing fiscal caution and constitutional principle over political popularity. Robert even sought the Republican presidential nomination multiple times, coming remarkably close on more than one occasion, though he never ultimately reached the White House himself. His career demonstrated that the Taft family's political influence extended well beyond a single presidency, shaping American governance for decades afterward. It's a compelling example of how the legacy of a presidential family can evolve, with children sometimes becoming just as historically significant as the parent who once occupied the nation's highest office. Number 51. And speaking of presidential daughters who built distinguished academic careers of their own, William Howard Taft's daughter Helen went on to become a respected historian and eventually served as dean at Bryn Mawr College, a prestigious institution for women's education. Helen's intellectual accomplishments stood out at a time when opportunities for women in academia remained limited, and her rise to a leadership position reflected both her personal determination and considerable scholarly ability. She specialized in history, contributing meaningfully to academic research while also shaping the educational experiences of countless young women during her tenure. Helen's path diverged sharply from the more ceremonial roles often expected of presidential children, positioning her instead as a genuine authority within her chosen field. Her work at Bryn Mawr placed her among a small but growing number of women, breaking into serious academic leadership during this period of American history. It's worth remembering that presidential families produce far more than politicians and socialites. They also produce scholars, in this case one who quietly and steadily built a legacy defined by education rather than politics. Helen Taft's academic achievements remain a lesser-known but genuinely impressive chapter of presidential family history. Number 52. And speaking of presidential daughters who pursued creative and spiritual paths far removed from politics, Woodrow Wilson's daughter Margaret worked as a professional singer before eventually devoting many years of her life to spiritual study and contemplative practice. Margaret trained seriously in music, performing publicly and pursuing her artistic ambitions with genuine dedication during a period when women in the public eye faced considerable scrutiny. Her musical career reflected a personal identity distinct from her father's political world, allowing her to carve out recognition based purely on her own talents and interests. Later in life, Margaret's focus shifted dramatically, leading her toward deep spiritual exploration, eventually taking her to India, where she became involved in an ashram community. This transition marked a striking departure from her earlier years in the public spotlight, revealing a deeply introspective and searching side to her personality. Margaret's life illustrates how presidential children didn't always follow predictable paths defined by politics or privilege, sometimes choosing instead deeply personal journeys shaped by artistic passion and spiritual searching. It's a gentle reminder that behind the formality of presidential family life, individual children often pursue deeply unique and unexpected callings of their own. Number 53. And speaking of presidential daughters who express themselves through visual art rather than politics or public life, Woodrow Wilson's daughter Eleanor pursued painting with genuine dedication, eventually exhibiting her artwork publicly for others to appreciate. Eleanor's interest in art offered her a creative outlet distinct from the formal expectations placed upon presidential children, allowing her personal expression to exist somewhat separately from her father's political identity. Her paintings reportedly reflected careful attention and thoughtful technique, suggesting a genuine passion rather than a passing hobby adopted simply for appearances. Presidential children pursuing serious artistic careers were relatively uncommon during this era, making Eleanor's efforts a meaningful, if quiet, contribution to the broader cultural landscape of the time. Beyond her painting, Eleanor remained connected to her father's political world, later writing about her family's experiences and preserving valuable historical insight into Wilson's presidency. Her artistic pursuits, however, remain a distinct and personal chapter of her life, separate from politics entirely. It's a subtle but meaningful example of how presidential children sometimes sought creative fulfillment far removed from the pressures and expectations of public political life, leaving behind a quieter, more personal legacy. Number 54. And speaking of memorable White House weddings that captured public attention, Woodrow Wilson's daughter Jessie became the first presidential child married inside the White House since 1893, drawing considerable public interest and media coverage at the time. Jesse's wedding brought a rare moment of joyful celebration to the Wilson White House, offering the public a glimpse of personal happiness amid the more serious responsibilities of the presidency. White House weddings involving presidential children remained relatively uncommon throughout American history, making each occurrence a notable and widely discussed event. Jesse's ceremony followed long-standing traditions associated with formal presidential family celebrations, blending personal significance with the symbolic weight of taking place within such a historically important residence. The event offered a brief pause from the political pressures Woodrow Wilson faced during his presidency, allowing the family a shared moment of warmth and celebration. It's a lovely reminder that even within the formal, often serious atmosphere of presidential life, moments of genuine personal joy still found space to unfold. Jessie Wilson's wedding remains a charming historical footnote, connecting her family's story to a broader tradition of milestone celebrations held within the White House's storied walls. Number 55. And speaking of presidential legacies that took unexpected turns, Warren G. Harding left behind no acknowledged children during his lifetime, a detail that stood in quiet contrast to the family narratives surrounding so many other presidents. Harding and his wife Florence never had children together, and for decades this was simply understood as a straightforward biographical fact. It wasn't until much later, well after his presidency and his death in office, that historians and journalists began examining private letters and personal testimonies, suggesting Harding may have fathered a daughter outside his marriage. These claims remained speculative and unconfirmed for generations, existing mostly in whispered rumor rather than documented certainty. Only decades later did DNA testing provide some clarity, adding a strange and unusually modern chapter to a presidency already remembered for scandal and controversy. Harding's situation remains unlike that of almost any other president, a case where the question of children wasn't settled during his lifetime at all. It's a curious reminder that presidential family histories aren't always neatly recorded in real time, and sometimes the full truth doesn't surface until long after everyone involved has passed away, leaving historians to piece together the quiet corners of a presidency once thought fully understood. Number 56. And speaking of presidential children whose lives were cut tragically short, Calvin Coolidge's younger son, Calvin Jr., died as a teenager after developing a blister while playing tennis on the White House courts. What began as a minor injury quickly turned serious when the blister became infected, leading to blood poisoning that doctors at the time were unable to treat effectively. Within just days, the previously healthy 16-year-old was gone, a devastating loss that struck the Coolidge family while they were living in the White House itself. President Coolidge later wrote that when his son died, the power and glory of the presidency died with him, revealing just how deeply the tragedy affected him personally. The nation mourned alongside the grieving family, and the event served as a sobering reminder of how limited medical treatment still was during this era, even for a family with access to the best care available. Calvin Jr.'s death remains one of the most heartbreaking moments in presidential family history, a quiet tragedy unfolding behind the White House's grand exterior. It's a gentle reminder that no amount of privilege or position could shield a family from the fragile uncertainties of life during that time. Number 57. And speaking of presidential children who chose a quieter, more private path following unimaginable loss, Calvin Coolidge's surviving son John went on to build a steady career within the railroad industry, largely avoiding public life altogether. Unlike some presidential children who leaned into politics or public service, John seemed to prefer a life defined by routine, professionalism, and privacy rather than visibility or influence. His work within the railroad sector allowed him to build a career based on his own merits, separate from the immense weight of his father's presidency and his brother's tragic passing. John rarely sought public attention, and historical records reflect a life lived with quiet consistency rather than dramatic public milestones. Given the emotional toll his family endured after his brother's death, it's not difficult to imagine why a calmer, less publicly exposed existence may have felt appealing to him. John's story offers a subtle but meaningful contrast to the flashier paths some presidential children pursued, reminding us that not every notable family produces individuals seeking the spotlight. It's a quiet, steady chapter within presidential history, proving that sometimes resilience looks less like ambition and more like simply moving forward with dignity and purpose. Number 58. And speaking of presidential daughters who played essential behind-the-scenes roles within the White House itself, Franklin Roosevelt's daughter Anna frequently assisted her father, especially as his health declined during the pressures of World War II. Anna took on responsibilities well beyond typical ceremonial duties, often serving as an unofficial advisor, confidant, and even a gatekeeper managing who had access to the increasingly frail president. She helped coordinate his schedule, accompanied him to major wartime conferences, and provided steady emotional support during some of the most demanding years of his presidency. Anna's presence became especially significant as Roosevelt's physical condition worsened, with many historians noting that she quietly absorbed responsibilities that might otherwise have overwhelmed the aging president entirely. Her involvement extended even to sensitive diplomatic settings, including accompanying her father to the Yalta Conference in 1945, one of the most consequential meetings of the entire war. Anna's steady, capable presence allowed her father to continue functioning at the highest levels of leadership during an extraordinarily difficult period. It's a compelling reminder that presidential children sometimes carried far greater responsibility than official titles ever suggested, quietly shaping history from just behind the scenes. Number 59. And speaking of presidential sons who chose to serve directly in the very war their father was leading the nation through, Franklin Roosevelt's eldest son James joined the United States Marine Corps and saw active combat duty during World War II. James participated in dangerous operations across the Pacific Theater, including the daring Makin Island raid, placing him directly within the brutal realities of modern warfare. His decision to serve on the front lines carried particular weight given his father's position as commander-in-chief, adding a deeply personal dimension to the nation's broader wartime sacrifice. James's military service earned him recognition for bravery, and he continued to serve throughout the war with genuine distinction rather than relying on his family's prominence for an easier assignment. His experiences in combat shaped much of his later life, influencing both his personal outlook and his eventual entry into California politics after the war ended. James Roosevelt's willingness to face real danger, alongside ordinary servicemen, highlighted a shared sacrifice that transcended political privilege. It's a powerful reminder that presidential families, too, sent their own sons directly into harm's way during one of history's most devastating global conflicts. Number 60. And speaking of presidential sons who took to the skies rather than the ground during World War II, Franklin Roosevelt's son Elliot served as an officer within the Army Air Forces, contributing directly to the nation's aerial reconnaissance efforts. Elliot specialized in photographic reconnaissance missions, helping gather crucial intelligence used to plan major military operations across multiple theaters of the war. His work required flying dangerous missions over enemy territory, collecting images that shaped Allied strategy during pivotal moments of the conflict. Elliot rose steadily through the ranks, eventually achieving the position of brigadier general, a notable accomplishment reflecting genuine competence rather than family connections alone. His service placed him in close proximity to real wartime danger, reinforcing a pattern among Roosevelt's sons of choosing active military participation rather than safer, more comfortable alternatives. After the war, Elliot pursued a varied career that included writing, business ventures, and eventually local politics, reflecting a restless, adventurous personality throughout his life. It's a fitting reminder that presidential children during this era often felt a genuine pull toward service, understanding that their family's prominence came with responsibilities rather than exemptions from wartime sacrifice. Number 61. And speaking of presidential families who endured the loss of a child far too soon, Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt's first son, also named Franklin Jr., died from a heart condition before he even reached his first birthday. Born in 1909, well before Franklin Roosevelt's presidency, the infant's death came as a devastating blow to the young couple, who were still building both their family and their future together. Medical understanding of infant heart conditions was extremely limited during this era, leaving doctors with few options to intervene despite their best efforts. Eleanor later wrote about the profound grief this loss caused her, describing it as one of the most painful experiences of her early married life. The couple would go on to have several more children, but the memory of their firstborn's brief life remained a quiet, lasting sorrow throughout their marriage. Interestingly, the Roosevelts later gave the same name, Franklin Jr., to a subsequent son born a few years afterward, a gesture that speaks to how deeply they wished to honor the child they'd lost. It's a gentle reminder that even families destined for extraordinary public lives first experience private grief, like countless others before them. Number 62. And speaking of Roosevelt's sons who found their calling on the open seas, John Roosevelt, the youngest of Franklin and Eleanor's children, served in the United States Navy during World War II. John enlisted and worked his way through the ranks, eventually serving aboard the aircraft carrier USS Wasp during active combat operations in the Pacific Theater. Like his brothers, John chose to place himself directly within the dangers of wartime service, rather than seeking a safer path shielded by his father's position. His naval career reflected a quieter, less publicly documented contribution compared to his more visible siblings, yet it carried the same genuine risk and responsibility. After the war concluded, John moved away from politics almost entirely, eventually working in retail and business, rather than following the family's traditional public service path. Notably, John was the only one of Franklin Roosevelt's sons to later align himself with a different political party than his father, a shift that reportedly caused some friction within the family. His life offers a subtle reminder that even within one remarkable family, each child carved out a distinctly individual path forward. Number 63. And speaking of presidential daughters who pursued creative passions far removed from politics, Harry Truman's daughter Margaret built a genuine singing career before turning her attention to writing popular mystery novels. Margaret trained seriously as a vocalist and performed publicly as a coloratura soprano, even appearing on national radio broadcasts during the late 1940s. Her singing career drew significant media attention, partly because critics weren't always kind, including one particularly harsh review that famously prompted her father to send an angry letter defending her talent. Despite mixed professional reception, Margaret continued performing for several years before eventually shifting her creative energy toward writing. She went on to author a long series of successful mystery novels set within Washington political circles, drawing on her first-hand knowledge of life inside the nation's capital. Her books became genuinely popular, allowing her to build a respected literary career entirely separate from her father's political legacy. Margaret's willingness to pursue artistic ambitions, even amid public scrutiny, reflects a determined independence that defined much of her adult life. It's a charming reminder that presidential children often carried creative talents of their own, waiting patiently for the right stage to reveal them. Number 64. And speaking of memorable White House family celebrations, Margaret Truman's wedding to journalist Clifton Daniel took place while her father was still serving as president. The ceremony was held at Trinity Episcopal Church in Independence, Missouri, rather than at the White House itself, reflecting the family's continued connection to their Midwestern roots even amid national prominence. The 1956 wedding drew considerable public attention, generating extensive newspaper coverage given Margaret's visibility as the president's only child. Clifton Daniel worked as a respected journalist for the New York Times, adding an interesting dynamic to the union between a prominent political family and a member of the national press. The couple's marriage would later produce 4 sons, and Margaret continued balancing family life alongside her ongoing writing career for decades afterward. Despite the public interest surrounding the event, the Trumans reportedly aimed to keep the ceremony relatively modest and personal, rather than overly elaborate. It's a warm reminder that even amid the formality of presidential life, families still found ways to celebrate deeply personal milestones surrounded by loved ones rather than spectacle. Number 65. And speaking of presidential families who experienced heartbreaking loss well before reaching the White House, Dwight Eisenhower's first son, Dowd, died from scarlet fever at just 3 years old. Dowd, affectionately nicknamed Icky by his parents, passed away in 1921 while the Eisenhowers were stationed at an army post in Texas, long before Dwight's military career reached its later heights. The loss devastated the young couple, and Eisenhower later described it as the greatest disappointment and hurt of his entire life, a sentiment he carried privately for decades afterward. Mamie Eisenhower reportedly found it difficult to discuss her son's death even many years later, reflecting just how deeply the grief lingered within the family. The couple continued sending flowers to Dowd's grave every year on his birthday, a quiet, private tradition maintained throughout their long marriage. This early tragedy occurred decades before Eisenhower's presidency, yet it remained a defining emotional chapter throughout his life. It's a somber reminder that public figures often carry private sorrows that shape them profoundly, even when history remembers them primarily for their later achievements. Number 66. And speaking of presidential sons who built distinguished careers of genuine substance, Dwight Eisenhower's surviving son John pursued a path combining military service, historical writing, and diplomacy. John graduated from West Point and served as an Army officer, eventually reaching the rank of brigadier general through years of dedicated service. Beyond his military career, John became a respected historian, authoring detailed and well-regarded books examining major military campaigns, including works focused on World War II and the American Civil War. His writing reflected both first-hand military understanding and careful scholarly research, earning him genuine respect within historical circles independent of his father's legacy. Later in life, John served as United States ambassador to Belgium, further expanding his contributions to public service beyond the battlefield. Throughout his career, John maintained a reputation for thoughtful, measured professionalism rather than relying on his father's fame to advance his opportunities. His combination of military expertise, literary skill, and diplomatic service made him one of the more multifaceted presidential children in American history. It's a fitting reminder that talent and dedication could flourish meaningfully within a family already deeply connected to national leadership. Number 67. And speaking of presidential children whose pets became genuine celebrities in their own right, John Kennedy's daughter Caroline kept a pony named Macaroni on the White House grounds during her father's presidency. Macaroni quickly became a favorite subject for photographers, often seen grazing near the South Lawn or accompanying Caroline on quiet afternoon walks. The pony received so much fan mail that White House staff reportedly had to help manage the flood of letters and gifts sent by children across the country. Macaroni's popularity reflected a broader public fascination with the Kennedy family's youthful energy, which brought a sense of warmth and approachability to the presidency. Caroline's affection for the pony was well documented in photographs that appeared in newspapers and magazines throughout the early 1960s. The image of a small child leading her pony across the White House lawn became one of the era's most enduring visual symbols. It's a gentle reminder that even amid the weight of national responsibility, small moments of childhood charm found their way into the public spotlight. Number 68. And speaking of images that captured a nation's collective heartbreak, John Kennedy Jr. was photographed saluting his father's funeral procession on his third birthday in November 1963. The photograph, taken just days after President Kennedy's assassination, showed the young boy standing solemnly as the casket passed by, offering a small salute that seemed far beyond his years. The image became one of the most widely reproduced photographs in American history, symbolizing both innocence and profound loss. John Jr. was far too young to fully understand the significance of the moment, though he later spoke about growing up aware of how deeply that single photograph resonated with the public. His mother, Jacqueline Kennedy, reportedly encouraged him beforehand, though accounts vary on how spontaneous the gesture truly was. Regardless of its origin, the photograph became a defining symbol of national mourning during an extraordinarily difficult period. It's a quiet reminder that even the smallest gestures from a grieving child can leave a lasting mark on an entire country's memory. Number 69. And speaking of the personal sorrows presidential families sometimes carried during their time in office, John Kennedy's infant son Patrick died in August 1963 after being born prematurely with a lung condition doctors of the era struggled to treat. Patrick Bouvier Kennedy lived only 2 days, and his death came as a painful blow to both John and Jacqueline Kennedy just months before the president's own assassination. Medical technology at the time offered limited options for treating underdeveloped lungs in premature infants, a challenge that would later be addressed through advances inspired partly by cases like Patrick's. Jacqueline Kennedy reportedly found comfort in the outpouring of public sympathy that followed, even as she grieved privately within the walls of the White House. The couple buried their son quietly, and Jacqueline later requested that Patrick's remains be moved to rest beside John Kennedy's grave at Arlington National Cemetery. It's a somber reminder that even families living amid extraordinary privilege and attention were not spared from the quiet grief so many parents have known throughout history. Number 70. And speaking of joyful ceremonies held within the walls of the White House itself, Lyndon Johnson's daughter, Linda Bird, married Marine Corps Captain Charles Robb in the East Room in December 1967. The wedding took place during the height of the Vietnam War, adding a layer of poignancy given Rob's upcoming deployment overseas shortly after the ceremony. The event drew significant national attention, blending the formality of a state occasion with the personal warmth of a family celebration. Linda wore an elegant gown as guests filled the historic room, marking one of the relatively rare weddings held entirely within the White House itself. Charles Robb would later go on to serve as governor of Virginia and eventually as a United States senator, extending the family's connection to public service well beyond the Johnson presidency. The wedding remains fondly remembered as one of the more graceful ceremonial moments of the Johnson years. It's a warm reminder that even amid national turmoil, families found space for celebration and hope. Number 71. And speaking of Johnson family celebrations that captured public attention, Lyndon Johnson's daughter Lucy married Patrick Nugent at Washington's Shrine of the Immaculate Conception in August 1966. The Grand Basilica setting reflected Lucy's Catholic faith, and the ceremony drew large crowds eager to witness a presidential wedding held outside the White House grounds. Guests included prominent political figures alongside family friends, blending formality with genuine personal warmth throughout the day. The wedding received extensive media coverage, offering the public a glimpse of the Johnson family during a period otherwise dominated by news of the Vietnam War. Lucy and Patrick later had several children, and the couple remained a visible part of the extended Johnson family for decades afterward. The ceremony stands as one of the more elaborate presidential family weddings held during the 20th century. It's a fitting reminder that even amid difficult national moments, personal milestones offered welcome occasions for celebration and unity. Number 72. And speaking of White House weddings held beneath the open sky, Richard Nixon's daughter Tricia married Edward Cox in the Rose Garden in June 1971. The outdoor ceremony marked a rare and elegant moment in presidential history, chosen deliberately for its natural beauty rather than the grandeur of an indoor stateroom. Rain threatened the event, but the skies cleared just in time, allowing the ceremony to proceed exactly as planned amid blooming flowers and careful landscaping. Tricia's wedding remains the only Rose Garden wedding held for a presidential child, giving it a lasting distinction within White House history. The event drew significant media coverage, offering a rare softer moment during a presidency often defined by political tension. Edward Cox later pursued a career in law and remained closely connected to Republican political circles for years afterward. It's a gentle reminder that even the most politically charged administrations found room for quiet, personal beauty amid the pressures of public life. Number 73. And speaking of presidential families whose personal connections intertwined in unexpected ways, Richard Nixon's daughter Julie married David Eisenhower, the grandson of former President Dwight Eisenhower, in December 1968. The marriage created a quiet symbolic link between two of the most significant Republican presidencies of the 20th century, joining families that had shaped American politics for decades. The couple met while attending nearby colleges, and their relationship developed steadily, long before either family occupied the national spotlight in quite the same way. Their wedding took place at New York's Marble Collegiate Church, drawing attention not just for its personal significance, but for the historical weight carried by both surnames. David Eisenhower later wrote extensively about his grandfather's presidency, drawing on family insight few historians could access firsthand. Julie remained active in public life for years afterward, often speaking about both her father's and her husband's family legacies. It's a quiet reminder that behind the formality of politics, personal relationships often connect history in ways textbooks rarely capture. Number 74. And speaking of ordinary teenage milestones playing out inside extraordinary surroundings, Gerald Ford's daughter Susan hosted her senior prom in the East Room of the White House in 1975. The decision came after Susan expressed disappointment about missing a typical prom experience due to her family's unusual living situation. Rather than let the moment pass, the Ford family arranged for her school event to be held within the White House itself, complete with a live band and decorations suited for a proper teenage celebration. Photographs from the evening show Susan dancing among friends beneath the same chandeliers that had witnessed state dinners and diplomatic gatherings. The event became one of the more light-hearted stories associated with the Ford presidency, offering a glimpse of ordinary adolescence unfolding in an extraordinary setting. Susan later reflected fondly on the evening, noting how strange yet wonderful it felt to celebrate such a normal milestone in such an unusual place. It's a gentle reminder that even amid the formality of the presidency, families still made room for the simple joys of growing up. Number 75. And speaking of presidential children who pursued creative paths far removed from politics, Gerald Ford's son Stephen became a professional actor, appearing in numerous film and television productions throughout his career. Stephen's interest in acting developed gradually, and he eventually found steady work in daytime television, including a long run on a popular soap opera. He balanced his acting career with an equally significant interest in ranching, often stepping away from Hollywood to work on cattle ranches in the western United States. Stephen's willingness to pursue an unconventional path stood out among presidential children, many of whom gravitated toward law, business, or public service. He occasionally spoke about the challenge of being recognized as both an actor and the son of a former president, two identities that sometimes overlapped in unexpected ways. His career offered the public a lighter, more personal glimpse into the Ford family beyond formal politics. It's a fitting reminder that presidential children, like anyone else, often followed their own passions rather than a predetermined path. Number 76. And speaking of presidential children who found their calling behind the camera rather than in front of it, Gerald Ford's son Jack pursued a career in television production and executive work after leaving college. Jack developed an early interest in media and environmental issues, eventually working on documentary and television projects that reflected both passions. His work allowed him to remain connected to public discourse without stepping directly into elected politics, a path several members of his generation seemed to favor. Jack occasionally discussed growing up in the White House, describing it as both a privilege and a strange kind of normal that shaped his understanding of public life. He maintained a lower public profile than some of his siblings, preferring to let his professional work speak for itself. Jack's career reflected a broader trend among presidential children who chose media, business, or creative industries over traditional political careers. It's a quiet reminder that public service can take many forms beyond the offices most closely associated with government. Number 77. And speaking of quiet family decisions that expanded a presidential household, Gerald and Betty Ford adopted their youngest son Michael shortly after his birth in 1950, long before Gerald Ford entered national politics. The adoption reflected a personal chapter of the family's life that predated their time in the public eye by decades. Michael grew up alongside his siblings largely outside the spotlight, later choosing a path in theology and religious education rather than politics or business. He eventually worked at a Christian college, focusing on ministry and student life rather than public office. Michael occasionally spoke about his father's presidency with a sense of measured reflection, emphasizing the values instilled in the family long before the White House became part of their story. His path stood apart from his siblings, offering a different perspective on what it meant to grow up as a Ford. It's a gentle reminder that even within one family, children often found remarkably different ways to define their own lives. Number 78. And speaking of White House pets that captured the public's imagination through their delightfully unusual names, Jimmy Carter's daughter Amy brought her Siamese cat Misty Malarkey Yin Yang along when the family moved into the White House in 1977. The cat's elaborate name quickly became a point of curiosity for reporters and the public alike, offering a small dose of levity during a presidency often focused on serious economic and international challenges. Amy, still a young child during her father's time in office, was frequently photographed with the cat, reinforcing the more relaxed and family-oriented image the Carters cultivated. Misty Malarkey Yin Yang became something of a minor celebrity, occasionally mentioned in news coverage alongside more substantial policy discussions. The cat's presence reflected the Carter family's efforts to maintain a sense of normal childhood for Amy, despite the unusual surroundings of the White House. It's a lighthearted reminder that even the grandest historical stages sometimes made space for something as simple and charming as a child's beloved pet. Number 79. And speaking of children who found creative ways to carve out their own space within the White House grounds, Amy Carter had a treehouse built near the White House during her father's presidency in the late 1970s. The structure gave her a private retreat where she could read, play, and simply be a child amid the formalities surrounding her family's daily life. Secret Service agents kept a discreet watch nearby, though Amy often used the treehouse to escape the constant presence of staff and visitors, if only for a little while. The treehouse became a symbol of the Carter family's efforts to preserve some semblance of ordinary childhood, despite their extraordinary circumstances. Amy was known for bringing books along, often reading during official events, a habit that occasionally drew attention from the press. Her treehouse rarely made headlines, but it remained a quiet fixture of her childhood years. It's a gentle reminder that even a president's daughter needed a small, ordinary place of her own, tucked away from the weight of history unfolding just beyond the branches. Number 80. And speaking of family decisions that reflected compassion beyond national borders, Ronald Reagan's daughter Maureen and her husband adopted a daughter from Uganda during the 1990s. The adoption reflected Maureen's broader interests in humanitarian causes, which she pursued actively throughout her adult life, often traveling internationally to support various charitable efforts. She spoke openly about the joys and challenges of expanding her family through international adoption, describing it as one of the most meaningful decisions of her life. Maureen remained politically engaged as well, serving in Republican Party leadership roles and advocating for women's involvement in politics. Her humanitarian work often existed quietly alongside her political career, though she rarely sought attention for the adoption itself. Friends and family described her as deeply committed to causes involving children's welfare, a passion that extended well beyond her own household. Maureen passed away in 2001, but her legacy included both her political contributions and her personal commitment to family, however unconventionally formed. It's a quiet reminder that presidential children often built lives defined as much by personal compassion as by public service. Number 81. And speaking of presidential children who explored creative writing under their own chosen names, Ronald Reagan's daughter Patty published early fiction using the name Patty Davis, her mother's maiden name, rather than the more recognizable Reagan surname. The choice allowed her to establish an identity somewhat separate from her father's political career, giving her writing room to breathe outside the shadow of the presidency. Patty's novels often explored complex family dynamics, themes that some readers speculated drew loosely from her own upbringing, though she rarely confirmed direct parallels. She also became known for her outspoken political views, which frequently diverged sharply from her father's positions, creating a notable and closely watched contrast within the family. Patty later wrote memoirs discussing her relationship with her parents more directly, offering readers a deeply personal perspective on life within a prominent political household. Her writing career spanned decades, blending fiction, nonfiction, and journalism into a body of work distinctly her own. It's a fitting reminder that presidential children sometimes chose entirely different paths to make sense of their unusual upbringing, using words rather than politics to tell their story. Number 82. And speaking of unexpected career paths pursued by presidential children, Ronald Reagan's son Ron left college to join the prestigious Joffrey Ballet, pursuing a career in professional dance rather than continuing his academic studies. The decision surprised many observers at the time, given the unconventional nature of a president's son choosing ballet over more traditional pursuits like law, business, or politics. Ron trained rigorously, dedicating himself fully to the demanding physical and artistic discipline required of professional dancers. His career with the Joffrey Ballet lasted several years, during which he toured and performed extensively, earning respect within the dance community for his commitment and skill. Ron later transitioned into journalism and broadcasting, becoming a familiar voice on radio and television discussing politics and current events. He often reflected on his ballet years as formative, shaping his discipline and worldview long after he left the stage. His path illustrated a broader pattern among presidential children who pursued passions entirely unrelated to their family's political prominence. It's a gentle reminder that even within famously political families, some children found their truest expression far from any campaign trail or office. Number 83. And speaking of quiet family decisions made long before public life began, Ronald Reagan and his first wife Jane Wyman adopted their son Michael shortly after his birth in 1945, years before Reagan entered politics. Michael's upbringing included both the ordinary challenges of childhood and, later, complicated relationships with his famous parents, which he discussed candidly in interviews and memoirs. He often described feeling somewhat distanced from his father, particularly after Reagan and Wyman divorced, a separation that shaped much of his early life. Michael pursued various business ventures throughout adulthood, occasionally intersecting with public commentary on his father's legacy and presidency. He also became known for his religious faith, which he credited with helping him process a sometimes difficult family history. Michael's story offered a more complicated perspective on the Reagan family, one that balanced admiration with honest reflection on personal struggles. It's a quiet reminder that presidential families, much like any other, carried private complexities rarely visible from the outside looking in. Number 84. And speaking of firsts that quietly made history within a presidential family, George W. Bush's daughters Barbara and Jenna were the first twin daughters born to a future president, arriving in 1981, years before their father's time in office. The twins grew up largely outside the political spotlight until their father's presidency began in 2001, at which point their lives suddenly became subject to significant public attention. Jenna pursued a career in education and later journalism, while Barbara focused on public health initiatives and global health advocacy. Both sisters occasionally spoke about the challenges of adjusting to life as adult children within an actively serving presidential family, particularly regarding privacy and public scrutiny. They maintained a close relationship throughout their lives, often appearing together at family events and public engagements. Their experiences offered a modern glimpse into how presidential children navigated early adulthood while their father's administration unfolded around them. It's a fitting reminder that even something as simple as being twins added a distinctive chapter to their family's unique place in American history. Number 85. And speaking of presidential children who chose classrooms over campaign trails, Jenna Bush Hager spent time teaching elementary school in Baltimore before she ever appeared regularly on national television. She worked with young students in an underserved school district, an experience she later described as formative in shaping her understanding of educational inequality across the country. Jenna balanced the demands of teaching with the unusual reality of being a president's daughter, often trying to keep her classroom life separate from the attention surrounding her family. She wrote about her experiences in a book focused on children facing difficult circumstances around the world, drawing partly from what she witnessed in her own teaching career. Eventually, Jenna transitioned into journalism and TV hosting, becoming a familiar presence on morning programs. Still, she frequently credited her time in the classroom with grounding her perspective on public service. It's a quiet reminder that some presidential children found meaning not in politics, but in the simple, steady work of teaching others to read and grow. Number 86. And speaking of presidential children who turned their attention toward global health, Barbara Pierce Bush co-founded an organization dedicated to improving healthcare access in developing communities around the world. The initiative trained young health professionals and placed them in underserved regions, aiming to strengthen local medical systems rather than simply providing temporary aid. Barbara traveled extensively to support this work, often visiting clinics and hospitals in countries facing significant healthcare shortages. She spoke publicly about the importance of sustainable health equity, framing her work as a long-term investment in global well-being rather than a quick fix. Her efforts earned recognition from health organizations and government leaders alike, though she rarely sought personal attention for the initiative's success. Barbara's path reflected a broader trend among presidential children who use their visibility to support causes with lasting humanitarian impact. It's a fitting reminder that growing up in the White House sometimes inspired a lifelong commitment to helping people who lived far beyond its walls. Number 87. And speaking of presidential children who experienced a major life change at a young age, Chelsea Clinton was only 12 years old when her family moved into the White House in early 1993. The transition meant adjusting to a new school, new friends, and an entirely new level of public scrutiny, all while still navigating the ordinary challenges of early adolescence. Chelsea's parents made deliberate efforts to shield her from excessive media attention, hoping she could experience something resembling a normal childhood despite her surroundings. She attended a private school in Washington, where classmates and teachers generally respected an unspoken agreement to let her simply be a student. Chelsea later reflected on those years as both exciting and disorienting, describing the White House as an unusual but ultimately loving place to grow up. Her adjustment period offered a glimpse into the emotional complexity many presidential children faced when suddenly thrust into national visibility. It's a gentle reminder that even a 12-year-old's world can change overnight when history comes knocking at the front door. Number 88. And speaking of ordinary childhood routines that continued even inside extraordinary surroundings, Chelsea Clinton kept up her ballet lessons throughout much of her time living in the White House. She had studied dance for years before her father's presidency began, and her parents encouraged her to continue pursuing the activity despite their new circumstances. Secret Service agents occasionally accompanied her to lessons, a strange but necessary adjustment to an otherwise familiar routine. Chelsea's continued involvement in ballet offered her a small sense of consistency during a period defined by dramatic change and constant public attention. She later spoke about how activities like dance helped her maintain a sense of identity separate from her father's political role. The lessons eventually gave way to other interests as she grew older, though she maintained an appreciation for the discipline and structure the practice had given her. It's a quiet reminder that even amid the formality of presidential life, small personal routines could offer children a meaningful sense of normalcy. Number 89. And speaking of presidential children who took time to reflect before continuing their education, Malia Obama chose to take a gap year after graduating high school, delaying her enrollment at Harvard University by a full year. During that time, she pursued various personal and professional experiences, including an internship in the entertainment industry that offered a glimpse into potential career interests. Malia's decision reflected a growing trend among students nationwide who used gap years to gain real-world experience before committing to a rigorous academic path. Her parents publicly supported the choice, emphasizing the importance of personal growth alongside formal education. When she eventually began her studies, Malia largely avoided the media spotlight, focusing on her coursework and campus life much like any other student. Her time at Harvard included studies in visual and environmental studies, an area reflecting her interest in storytelling and film. It's a fitting reminder that even a president's daughter sometimes needed a little extra time to figure out her own path forward. Number 90. And speaking of young children who found themselves living in the White House almost overnight, Sasha Obama was just 7 years old when her family moved in following her father's inauguration in 2009. Her early years in the White House included ordinary childhood milestones like losing teeth and celebrating birthdays, all set against an extraordinary backdrop most children would never experience. Sasha and her sister Malia attended a private school in Washington, where their parents worked hard to preserve as much normalcy as possible amid intense public interest. The Obama family often emphasized the importance of keeping their daughters' daily routines consistent, even as the world watched their every public appearance. Sasha grew up largely within view of the American public, yet her personal life remained relatively private, thanks to careful boundaries set by her parents. As she matured, she continued pursuing her own interests quietly, stepping only occasionally into the public eye. It's a gentle reminder that childhood, even inside the White House, still unfolded one ordinary day at a time. Number 91. And speaking of presidential children, whose early years spanned two very different worlds, Donald Trump Jr. divided part of his childhood between New York City and Czechoslovakia, where his mother Ivana had family ties. Summers spent abroad gave him exposure to a culture and language far removed from the fast pace of Manhattan real estate circles his father inhabited. He later spoke about how those trips shaped his appreciation for the outdoors, since much of his time overseas involved hiking and hunting with relatives rather than city life. Back home, his upbringing followed a more structured path, including private schooling and eventual enrollment at the University of Pennsylvania, a family tradition of sorts. Donald Jr. eventually joined the family business, focusing on development projects before becoming a more visible political figure during his father's campaigns. His childhood blend of European countryside and American city life offered a somewhat unusual foundation compared to other presidential children who grew up entirely within U.S. borders. It's a small reminder that even families closely associated with New York's skyline sometimes had roots stretching quietly overseas. Number 92. And speaking of presidential children who built careers long before stepping into government roles, Ivanka Trump spent years working in fashion and business, eventually launching her own clothing and accessories line. She studied at the Wharton School before joining the Trump Organization, where she oversaw various real estate and hotel projects. Her fashion brand expanded into department stores nationwide, giving her name recognition well beyond her family's business empire. Ivanka often described her approach to work as detail-oriented, emphasizing branding and design as much as deal-making. When her father entered the White House, she transitioned into a formal advisory role, focusing on issues like workforce development and paid family leave. The shift from boardroom to West Wing office marked an unusual career pivot, even among presidential children accustomed to public attention. She eventually stepped back from formal politics, returning to private life and business interests. Her path traced a fairly direct line from entrepreneurship to public service, illustrating how some presidential children move fluidly between the corporate world and the corridors of government power. Number 93. And speaking of presidential children who focus their public efforts on charitable causes, Eric Trump founded a charitable initiative aimed at supporting pediatric cancer research and treatment programs. The organization held annual fundraising events, drawing donations that were directed toward children's hospitals and medical research institutions. Eric often spoke about the personal motivation behind the charity, describing it as an effort to give back using the visibility his family name provided. Over the years, the foundation reported raising millions of dollars for children's health initiatives, drawing praise from medical organizations grateful for the sustained support. Eric balanced this charitable work with his role in the family's real estate business, managing various development and hospitality projects. During his father's presidency, he continued overseeing company operations while maintaining involvement in the charity's fundraising efforts. His focus on pediatric health causes offered a somewhat quieter contribution compared to the more public political roles taken on by other family members. It's a fitting reminder that presidential children sometimes channeled their resources toward causes far removed from the political spotlight surrounding their families. Number 94. And speaking of presidential children who briefly stepped into the music industry, Tiffany Trump released a pop single while attending the University of Pennsylvania, surprising many who primarily knew her as a quieter, less publicized member of the Trump family. The song received modest attention, generating curiosity mostly due to her father's growing political profile at the time. Tiffany largely stayed out of the spotlight compared to her siblings, focusing instead on her education, eventually earning both an undergraduate degree and a law degree. She occasionally appeared at high-profile family events, including her father's presidential campaign rallies and inauguration, though she generally avoided taking on a formal public role. Her brief foray into music offered a glimpse of personal interests separate from politics or business, a rare creative detour among presidential children, more commonly associated with corporate or governmental pursuits. Tiffany later pursued a legal career, stepping further from the public eye than most of her siblings. It's a gentle reminder that even within one family, presidential children often followed remarkably different paths toward adulthood. Number 95. And speaking of presidential children who experienced a delayed transition into White House life, Barron Trump remained in New York City with his mother for several months after his father's inauguration in January 2017. The decision allowed him to finish his school year without interruption, a choice his parents described as prioritizing stability during a major family transition. Secret Service protection extended to Trump Tower during this period, an unusual arrangement compared to previous presidential families who typically relocated together immediately. Barron eventually moved to Washington, D.C. in the summer of 2017, joining his parents at the White House and enrolling in a private school nearby. His early years in the public eye were marked by relatively limited media exposure, as his parents made deliberate efforts to shield him from excessive attention. Barron occasionally appeared at official events, though his day-to-day life remained mostly private throughout his father's presidency. It's a quiet reminder that even presidential children sometimes needed a little extra time before stepping fully into their new, very public surroundings. Number 96. And speaking of presidential children who turned personal loss into public purpose, Hunter Biden helped establish a foundation named in honor of his late brother, Beau Biden, who passed away from brain cancer in 2015. The organization focused on issues including foster care support, domestic violence prevention, and other causes Beau had championed throughout his career in public service. Hunter worked alongside other family members to shape the foundation's mission, drawing on his brother's legacy as a former Delaware Attorney General known for his advocacy work. The foundation aimed to continue initiatives Beau had started, extending his influence well beyond his shortened life. Hunter's involvement reflected a deeply personal effort to preserve his brother's memory through tangible, ongoing charitable work rather than symbolic gestures alone. The Biden family often spoke publicly about how Beau's death shaped their approach to public service, framing the foundation as part of that broader emotional and civic legacy. It's a somber reminder that behind many charitable efforts by presidential children lies a very personal story of loss, memory, and quiet determination to carry a loved one's work forward. Number 97. And speaking of presidential children who chose military service over a quieter path through life, Beau Biden served for years in the Delaware Army National Guard, eventually deploying to Iraq in 2008 as part of a Judge Advocate General unit. He balanced his military obligations with a career in public service, serving as Delaware's Attorney General while maintaining his commitment to the Guard. Fellow soldiers described him as someone who insisted on being treated like everyone else despite his family's growing political profile. His deployment meant stepping away from his legal and political career for a full year, spending that time overseas rather than campaigning or holding office back home. Beau rarely spoke publicly about the specifics of his deployment, preferring to let his service speak for itself rather than using it for political advantage. After returning home, he continued his work in Delaware politics, eventually being considered a rising figure within the state's Democratic circles. His military background added a layer of quiet credibility to his public service, something colleagues often mention when discussing his character. Beau's dedication to service, both in uniform and in office, left a lasting impression on those who worked alongside him. It's a reminder that even amid national political dynasties, some presidential children chose to serve in uniform far from the spotlight, treating deployment as simply part of the job rather than a headline. Number 98. And speaking of presidential children who focus their energy on social causes rather than politics, Ashley Biden built a career centered on social work, spending years supporting programs aimed at helping vulnerable children and families in Delaware. She worked directly with at-risk youth, gaining hands-on experience in the kind of community-level work that rarely draws national attention. Later, she combined her social work background with a passion for fashion, founding a clothing line designed to fund social programs rather than simply generate profit. The venture donated proceeds toward organizations supporting formerly incarcerated individuals and other underserved communities, blending business with advocacy in a fairly direct way. Ashley often described her work as an extension of lessons learned from her family about public service, though she generally avoided placing herself at the center of political conversations. During her father's presidency, she occasionally appeared at public events, but largely maintained the same low-key approach to her work that she'd practiced for years beforehand. Colleagues in the nonprofit world noted her consistent focus on practical outcomes rather than publicity, a trait that set her apart from the more visible roles taken on by other presidential children throughout history. It's a quiet reminder that social impact doesn't always require a national stage. Sometimes it just requires steady, unglamorous work. Number 99. And speaking of presidential family milestones that unfolded within the White House itself, Naomi Biden, granddaughter of President Joe Biden, married Peter Neal in a ceremony held on the White House South Lawn in November 2022. The event marked a rare occurrence in American history, as weddings actually held on White House grounds involving direct descendants of a sitting president have been relatively uncommon. Naomi, a lawyer by profession, had grown up largely outside the intense spotlight surrounding her grandfather's earlier political career, only stepping into broader public visibility once he became president. The wedding itself blended personal tradition with the formality expected of an event held at such a historic location, complete with security arrangements befitting the setting. Family members described the day as deeply personal despite its grand backdrop, emphasizing that for them, it remained primarily a family celebration rather than a political statement. Naomi occasionally spoke publicly about balancing her professional career with the unusual experience of being part of a prominent political family, noting that everyday life continued much as it had before. The White House wedding became one of the more memorable moments associated with the Biden family's time in Washington, a rare lighthearted milestone amid the usual weight of presidential history. It's a gentle reminder that even within the busy machinery of national politics, ordinary family milestones still found their way onto the calendar. Number 100. And speaking of presidential children who simply wanted to live outside the shadow of history, many of them, across generations and across political parties, eventually sought out lives defined by ordinary work rather than lingering fame. Some became teachers, lawyers, doctors, or small business owners, deliberately choosing paths far removed from the intense scrutiny they experienced growing up. Others stayed closer to public life, but focused on causes rather than personal recognition, quietly building careers in social work, healthcare, or community advocacy. Across more than 2 centuries of American history, presidential children have shown remarkably similar instincts once their family's time in the spotlight ended: a desire for privacy, stability, and the freedom to define themselves outside their parents' legacy. Some struggled with the transition, finding it difficult to escape constant comparisons or public expectations. Others adapted quickly, blending into professional life with little fanfare. Whether by choice or circumstance, the vast majority eventually settled into lives that looked, on the surface, fairly ordinary. It's a fitting note to end on, a reminder that behind every historic family name are individuals who, in the end, mostly just wanted the chance to live quietly, to find their own paths, and maybe after all this history, finally get a good night's sleep.